We're here to celebrate the life of Martin Luther King Jr. and the inspiration and strength that he gave us. Forgive me if I start us off on a somber note with a mention of his death on April 4th, 1968. Dr. King spent that day in Memphis at the Lorraine Motel, meeting with local leaders and working on his Poor People's March on Washington, set for later that month. At 6 p.m. on the evening of the 4th, he stepped out on a balcony to greet friends and was shot with one round from a rifle wielded by James Earl Ray. Scarcely 60 days after the loss of Dr. King, on the evening of June 4th, 1968, Senator Robert Kennedy addressed an emotional audience at the Ambassador Hotel in San Francisco. He had just won the California Democratic presidential primary. As he left the stage, he was shot by a young man named Sirhan Sirhan and died a day later. And just 5 months after that, on November 5th, 1968, Richard Nixon, successfully executing what later became known as the Southern Strategy, was elected President of the United States. Civil rights champion Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic nominee, lost, having garnered just 42% of the popular vote. Mr. Nixon edged him out with 43%, but another 14% on top of that was gathered by Alabama Governor George Wallace, who waged an explicitly segregationist campaign for the top office in the land. Just a personal note, as reported from my college newspaper, I covered Governor Wallace's political rally on Boston Common, just steps from the Massachusetts State House, where I currently meet with Representative Gordon, in September of 1968. Governor Wallace drew a big crowd. Mr. Nixon's election was not merely a setback. It was a victory for reaction against needed change. It was the counterfactual of the 1960s come to life, the hypothetical alternative outcome that was supposed to make you shake your head at the very thought of it, but that could never happen. And yet it happened. Dr. King wrote a speech and then an entire book entitled Why We Can't Wait. But the presidential outcome of 1968 was a devastating rebuke to his call for action. Black people would have to wait. And so would everyone else who hoped that the decade would end with a vindication of him and Senator Kennedy and their dreams for the country. Now, I know that many of us are hurting today in the aftermath of another presidential election. But if you're my age, you've seen worse, the events I've just described. And in the years since '68, all of us have found satisfaction and happiness and meaning in our personal lives and in the life of the nation. Mr. Nixon's victory was more than a rut in the road. It was a trench, but it was not the end of society's progress. Today, we find ourselves once again confronted by a dilemma. It's simply not reasonable to believe that all Trump voters are racist. But it is reasonable to suppose that all racists voted for Trump. So we might well ask, what would Dr. King do now? Well, he would not allow himself to be immobilized for long. Dr. King never held elective office. He was the preeminent citizen activist of his age. No institution commanded him to lead, and no process vested him with legal authority. He would appreciate our disbelief and disappointment. He'd know all about those. But then he'd summon us to do something, whatever works for each one of us, given the other demands we deal with in our lives. A second point, Dr. King would be tactically flexible. He always was. The most direct path to justice during his life led through Washington, D.C., and the defense of individual civil rights by a strong national government. But his death was followed by the Nixon win, and a very different atmosphere in our nation's capital. Had he lived to see Mr. Nixon in the White House, Dr. King would never have stopped organizing. But with Washington at least partially shut off to him, he would have found an alternative path. We have to be tactically flexible too. As in the late 60s, the national government is not our friend. We need to invest thought and discussion and resources into the development of a new federalism, a progressive reinvention of the power of individual states to assert their own values, set their own policies, and within the framework laid down by the Constitution, promote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not just for some, but for all. If, as a matter of national policy, a conservative U.S. Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade and denies women control of their pregnancies, courts and legislatures in progressive states can reestablish women's rights within their boundaries. If the federal government steps away from a commitment to fighting climate change, state governments can join Canadian provinces and the European Union to continue the fight. If President Trump and the U.S. Congress repeal the Affordable Care Act, Massachusetts can return to its precedent-setting local effort to ensure access for all. Success at the state level isn't automatic. It'll take real effort. But with the help of the people in this room and people like you across our state, we can achieve it here. A third and final point. Dr. King would have understood, as we all must understand, the tension between impatience and patience. He was justifiably impatient for change. But he also loved to quote abolitionist Theodore Parker of Massachusetts on slavery in the United States, to the effect that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Reverend Parker offered his words 10 years before Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The Reverend had to wait quite a while on the moral universe. As for Dr. King, he published a letter to the editor of the Atlanta Constitution contending that black people are, quote, entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of American citizens, end quote, in 1946, and would then see 18 years go by before the U.S. Congress enacted major legislation guaranteeing those rights. So let's not get too discouraged, and let's not be immobilized. The arc of the moral universe is long. We don't know how long, which is frustrating. And the arc won't always bend on its own. We'll have to work it. But justice awaits at the end. Dr. King knew this. It sustained him, and it will sustain us. Thank you.